It's system review time, and today we're having a look at the Amiga CD32. And before I start, I must say a great big thank you to Jamie, the Great British Gamer, who very generously gave this example to me. So, the Amiga CD32. It was released by Commodore in September of '93 and was promoted as the first 32-bit CD-based games console. This is not completely accurate. It's certainly the first released in the West, but in Japan the FM Towns Marty had been released a few months earlier. Some might though be able to argue that the Marty was not true 32-bit, as its architecture, while it was 32-bit internally, had a 16-bit external data bus. If you're a techie, you might know what that means. I don't. But there you are. Yes, certainly though, this was the first true, fully 32-bit CD-based games console in the West, and basically everywhere except Japan. It was released in Canada, but due to Commodore's non-payment of royalties on some patent for some piece of technology in the USA, it was never actually sold in the US. Examples, that they had basically a whole warehouse full of CD32s sitting in the Philippines, and they never made it to the US. Having said that, it is possible to find some NTSC CD32s in the US which were imported from Canada, so they are there, and there was some support from Commodore UK for US and Canadian NTSC CD32s. Component supply problems basically prevented this thing from selling nearly enough models to save Commodore from bankruptcy. They sold around 100,000 units in Europe, or was that in fact even in the UK? Well, we'll say Europe, which was very impressive considering it was done in a very short time, a matter of just a few months. But it wasn't enough, and Commodore went bankrupt. So let's have a look at this thing. It is a CD-based top loader. There you see the top loading thing. The design is very, very familiar. When you look at it, you think, haven't I seen something like that before? Yes, you have. Mega Drive Mark 1, anybody? Reset button there. Little LED lights there for power and CD accessing. Volume control here for your headphone jack. Nothing on that side. Nothing of any great interest underneath. Manufactured in the Philippines in September of '93. Model Amiga CD, ID number blah 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 blah, power blah blah, made in the Philippines blah blah blah. Yeah, okay. Right, on the side here, joystick port, another joystick port, but you can also use that for a mouse, and you can use that for a keyboard, which means you can do a good deal on here that you can do with an Amiga 1200. We'll get onto that in a moment. This also doubles up as a, is it parallel serial port, I think, something like that. On the back, what do we call these? RF? That's not RF, is it? It's composite. You got your monitor out, well, video out, left and right audios, S-video, RF, power, and the power switch. And this expansion here, well, it's not an expansion, there is an expansion port here. It's a edge connector thing which you can plug. But there were several things that were made to go into that. One was an MPEG video, what's the word for it? It would play video CDs basically. MPEG decoder, that's what I'm trying to say. There were also two attachments. One was called the SX1, which was a huge clunky great big thing that stuck out the back there. and allowed you to plug, had serial port, parallel port, floppy controller, all kinds of stuff that you could plug in there and basically use this as an Amiga 1200. And then there was something, that being such a clunky thing that you could basically knock off the edge connector and stop it working, there was another thing called the SX32, which rather than sticking out the back here, it went in there, took up all the space in this, or a large chunk of space, and you just had your ports sitting out the back here. It had floppy drive, hard drive interface, parallel serial, blah blah blah, and a 25 megahertz 68030, which is probably a good time to say what's actually in this thing. The CPU is a Motorola 68EC020. That's a 68020 without the memory management unit, and it runs at 14 megahertz, give or take a little bit. It's got 2 meg of RAM, which is chip RAM. That's shared between CPU and graphics chips. It's what Amiga enthusiasts would call slow RAM. What you could do if you had the SX32 was add extra RAM. 4 meg, I don't know if there was a 4 meg limit, but anyway, if you added extra RAM, that was known as fast RAM, and it was accessible only by the CPU and basically doubled the speed of the thing. Never mind putting on a faster CPU, just more RAM doubled the speed because the CPU didn't have to share it with the graphics chips. The operating system was Amiga OS 3.1, which was the first time 3.1 appeared on a Commodore product. It is much the same as Amiga OS 3, except it has support for CD-ROM drives. It's basically exactly the same operating system as I've got in my Amiga 1200 Tower, but it's got CD32 firmware. The front end, it doesn't boot into Workbench. In fact, Workbench isn't built in. You can get a CD and run Workbench on it. You do, of course, have to plug in a keyboard and mouse. And standard Amiga, I was going to say mice, will work on this. The keyboard, unless you've got an SX32, possibly the SX1, which will allow you to run a PC keyboard, your keyboard choices are limited. An Amiga 4000 keyboard. I've got this Micronic Tower, which takes the keyboard out of an Amiga 1200 and puts it into a case and gives it a standard Amiga keyboard plug, socket thingy, and that will fit on this. I imagine the 3001 and the 1000, maybe? I'm not sure about that. What else? AGA chipset, which is the same as is in the Amiga 1200 and 4000. It's screen modes 320 by 256 up to 1280 by 400. Sure it goes higher than that. In PAL, that would be some kind of weird interlace thing. There's another funky doofer in these that you don't get in Amiga 1200s and 4000s. It's called an Akiko chip, which, if I understand correctly, it is a CD controller, but the intention also was it was used for chunky to, is that planar? Yeah, it's a graphics mode anyway. Basically, from the kind of screen mode you would use for a game like Doom, it converts to and from that to the standard Amiga things, which are like tiled screen modes. Weird anyway, not good for 3D, so it's conversion so you can do first person shooters in the style of Doom. Yeah. Do I have anything else worth telling you? That's everything I had written down. So, oh yes, controllers. That is the standard CD32 controller. I haven't actually used this one. I find them visually interesting. I mean, we're used to them kind of looking more like that, but yeah, I do kind of like that. These are notoriously fragile, unreliable. They don't last very long, and even when they're working, they apparently don't feel very nice. I don't know. I haven't used this. I haven't tried it, but I do like the way it looks. I have been using this, which is like the basically the standard choice of controller for the CD32 when your standard ones have gone kaput, or if you just plain don't like them. It is the Competition Pro's CD32 pad. All the controls you would get on a normal CD32 pad, plus your turbo options for each button. Well, I don't know, pause and play, something maybe. But also this caught me out. It's a slow motion option, slow down, whatever. I was playing Super Frog the other night. It was one of the first games I loaded up, and it was running. Well, I haven't played Super Frog in a very, very long time, and I was sitting there playing it and thinking, this is really slow. Is there something, what's wrong here? I'm sure it should play faster than this. And it was only after a little while that I noticed this was in that position. And I clicked it back there, and it ran at a normal speed. So if you find yourself playing a really slow game on a CD32 and you think, well, this is rubbish, if you're playing on one of these, that's probably why, because I didn't know about it, so I was a bit confused. Power supply. Brick. This thing weighs a ton. Interestingly, it says C65. Were these intended for the Commodore C65? It's been suggested. I don't know. I just don't know. I mean, the colour obviously completely matches that, and what I've seen of a Commodore 65 was they weren't that colour. But anyway, who knows? Socket on the air, plug rather. I'm curious, given that this is an Amiga, why they used this. Why not just a standard Amiga power supply with a standard Amiga plug? I get that you probably need a different level of power going into there because of the CD-ROM, but I don't know why they used this. Maybe to stop you using an Amiga power supply on it if they had a different power rating. I'm guessing. So what do I actually think of this? Having used one for a bit, I mean, there are a number of noteworthy features. It will run home-burned CDs, shall we say. Let's call them backups, I would not dream of downloading the many disk images you can find on the internet. Yeah, of course not. It will play them. I have heard reports that it has trouble reading CDRs. You need to use like cheap Tesco branded CDs and burn them at a slow speed. Well, I've downloaded a public domain disc compilation thing. I did use a Tesco CD. I burned it at something like 52 times speed, whatever, and it worked just fine. So maybe this is just a good one. I really don't know. But it can be done. It does work, which is cool. But okay, historically, what do I think of this? I mean, Commodore did the CD-TV back in the day, and it bombed. People didn't know what it was, as a multimedia entertainment system. And it looked like a big square box that would just go in a rack. This knows what it is. This, you look at this, and remember, like the systems at the time, it was the SNES, the Mega Drive. We're probably more likely to see one of these than a 32X. This knows what it is. It's a games console. If you look at it, you know what it is. It is a games console. I have heard of there being reliability issues with the laser and with this doofer here, which holds the disc down onto there or something. I'm not completely sure. I have had no problems with this. It has proved to be completely reliable with me. I've run several games. You can get these compilations off of the internet, as I mentioned, and it runs them entirely reliably. You can fit many games onto a disc and play them off of that disc. Amiga games, there are Amiga game compilations, they don't have to be specifically CD32. A great many just standard Amiga games are compatible if they're put on a CD. So I think actually Commodore got the general design of this right. If they made a mistake, it was in not adding some fast RAM. That would have doubled the processing power in one move. You know, RAM was, well, it wasn't exceptionally cheap at that time, but you know, just a couple of meg would have done it and doubled the power of it. That was a bit of a short-sighted move on their part. Software, it lacked in appeal in some ways, because there was very little in the way of absolutely dedicated new software for it. Like, well, there wasn't really anything. Pretty much everything you saw on this was available for the Amiga already. Okay, you got some nice full motion video cutscenes, and you got full CD based music and stuff like that, and voice tracks on some games that you didn't get on the standard Amiga floppy based games. But in terms of exclusive games, there were none, not really. There were some that you didn't necessarily get on the Amiga, like Microcosm, but you could get that on other systems. It was on the CDI. Was it on the Mega CD? I'm not sure about that. Possibly on the 3DI, I'm not sure about that either. But anyway, it wasn't an exclusive. But I think in general terms, as a games console, it's good. I like almost everything about it. You know, there was some corner cutting in terms of cost. If they made a mistake with this, it was that old story of too little, too late. As in the 8-bit era, Commodore, Atari, Amstrad brought out their old computers bunged into a console. There will be those who say that's what Commodore did with this. Only, well, their computers didn't have CD-ROMs built in. It does work as a console concept, but it was too late. The 3DO was on the way, even the Jaguar actually has more processing power. The PS1 and the Saturn were on the way. People knew they were coming. It did not matter that this thing was 32-bit. If you looked at the games, yes, they had more colours than a Mega Drive game. But that was really all you could say about it. It was like playing Mega Drive games that were just a bit bigger and had nicer sound and a few more colours. But they were basically that kind of game. They looked 16-bit. They looked very nice 16-bit. But nevertheless, there was not that great leap that people knew they were going to get. Even the Jaguar was more impressive in its 3D capabilities and was significantly cheaper, I think. I don't know. I haven't looked up what this thing costs. Okay, having done a bit of Googling, £299 seems to be the general consensus on what this thing cost when it was released in the UK, meaning not cheap. Definitely too little too late. The Jaguar was significantly cheaper than that. The Amiga 1200 probably cost about that. In fact, was probably cheaper than that by the time this came out. So yeah, too little, too late, too expensive. But I like it. I find it very convenient having a stack of CDs which will very likely last longer than the floppies for the Amiga. I've got a mass of floppies for my Amiga 1200 and lots of them fail. I've had to like re-download ADF files and put them back onto disk to make a lot of them work because Amiga floppies fail. CDs, well, I've had some fail on me in the past when they'd sat in the loft for years and the heat and the cold and well, there shouldn't have been any condensation, but you know, they failed. But I think looked after CDs should last significantly longer. And it's a nice compact size, where a bleeding great big tower or even a desktop sized Amiga is, they're big. This, slap the disc in, turn it on, pick up your joypad, play. I like it. Reliability, I don't know, I can't comment yet. And you're always going to get that certain home computer clunkiness. The 16-bit home computers back in the day, and even 32-bit, the Amigas, the Atari STs, the Acorn Archimedes, games for those always had, or often had, a slightly unprofessional feel about them when compared to the consoles of that era, your SNES and your Mega Drive. But I've always liked that. I just see it as a certain charm that you get with the computer games from that era, and you get that feel with the CD32 games. Personally, I don't see that as a negative. I see it as an interesting feature, if you like. So yes, I don't think there's an awful lot more I can say about it. It's it is a cool thing to have. They're hard to find in the US, they're not so hard to find in Canada. They sell for a reasonable price on eBay. They've never been cheap. They're one of those things, people want them. Some of the people who've had them wish they hadn't, from what I've read. But I personally think it is a very nice system. And again, a big thank you to Jamie, the Great British Gamer, for very generously giving me this one. Okay, I think that's everything. I've probably forgotten a load of things that I meant to say. But anyway, thank you for watching.